YouTube. It takes a moment. And as soon as we go live, there we go. Okay. I'm Harvey Birdman. I'm the president of the Creve Coeur. I'm sorry, I got distracted here by all the technology around me. Starting over again, I'm Harvey Birdman. I'm president of the Maryland Heights Township Democratic Club. And assisting me tonight is Alan Harris Dalt, waving his hands over there. He's been very, very good at helping with all the technology and other things for our club. And I'd also like to introduce Florence Pullen. She's the president of the Creve Coeur Township Democratic Club. And Florence is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and I will put that up on the screen. And Florence, if you would.
Good evening, everyone. Let's say pledge, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic and one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, if there are any elected officials on the call, if you would introduce yourselves. I know we have a number of township committee people on. Any elected officials that want to introduce themselves? Okay, we'll let that. Sue Meredith, are you muted or something? I can't hear you.
No, I'm not muted. I don't think I am.
There you go.
Anyway, I just wanted to say hi. I'm Democratic Committee Woman for Creve Coeur Township.
Okay. Dave and Dale?
They're there.
They can't unmute. Anyway, that's Dave and Dale Steinberg. They are the committee people for Maryland Heights Township. Anyone else want to introduce themselves?
Diane Caston, Lee May Committee Woman and SD1 State Committee person.
Excellent. Mr. Gerber?
Yes, Al Gerber. I'm from Missouri River Township Committee Man, also a State Committee Man from the 24th Senate District.
Okay, I'm not sure I can see everyone, so if you would unmute yourself and introduce yourself if you're an elected person. Okay, I think we've covered that. Are there any announcements? Does anyone have any announcements they'd like to make before we get started? Okay. Well, with that.
Harvey.
Yes.
We do have several people with us who have been elected, like former State Representative Deb Lavender. I see her here, and there's a couple of others. Where'd they go?
I'll just say hi. Vicky's here. I'm not sure who else. Thank you, Sue.
Vicki England is also on the call, and I thought I saw Barb Frazier.
Okay.
But Vicky's on the call. I lost Barb.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming tonight for this interesting panel discussion. If you would, keep yourselves muted during the panel discussion itself, and then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards. You can always put questions in the chat at any time. And let me do the introductions. So the panel tonight is basically, what will it take for a Democrat to win the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Senator Roy Blunt? And what would the ideal candidate profile be if you could create such a person? What would that candidate look like? And then we'll have a question and answer period afterwards. Our panelists are Professor Sinclair from Washington University. Professor Sinclair's research interests include American politics and political methodology, with an emphasis on individual political behavior. She focuses on the social foundations of participatory democracy, the ways in which social media influences voting, donating, choosing a candidate, or identifying with a party. Professor Terry Jones is no stranger to this group. Professor Jones is the author of many books. He also has been a consultant to more than 70 governmental and nonprofit organizations and has held office in many professional and community organizations. His current research focuses on metropolitan governance, urban public policy, state government, and public opinion. Professor Ken Warren from St. Louis University conducts research in the areas of American politics, polling, elections, and national policy. He also conducts polls for the media, government, and other clients. Panelists, I will let you, decide who is so anxious that they want to speak first.
Well, that's me. No,
Great.
I'm teasing. I'm really enthusiastic to be here today. And I suppose since this is my first meeting, I actually would say maybe I'll let one of the other panelists go ahead. Would you like us to begin answering your questions? Like to speak for a few minutes and then take questions? What's the format here, Harvey?
Yeah, I'd rather if you speak for a few minutes on, what do you think the chances are of a Democrat being able to win in the state of Missouri, and what would it take for that to happen?
All right, well, then I would like to go third. Terry, why don't you go first?
Ken, is that okay with you, or do you want to?
It's fine, Terry. Go ahead.
Thank you, Betsy, for that. Well, I'm going to start with a discouraging word, because to answer that question, we need to look at evidence. To alert those of you who are not political scientists, and my congratulations on your not being one of the tribe, we have gone from a species that used to talk about absolutes or yes and no, what was known as classical hypothesis testing, to being Bayesian. That's a word that you can take home with you to show that you had the three professors speaking to your group tonight, which is to say express everything in probabilities. And most of you are familiar with Nate Silver, so he symbolizes that kind of movement. So the question is probably, we would phrase it not whether a Democrat could or could not win, or as opposed to what's the probability that a Democrat might win. And my answer to that question is under 15%. And my reasons for that are many, but I'll start with a reflection on how quickly the Missouri electorate has changed, and also talk about how unrapidly the Missouri demography has shifted. If we go back to 2012, we had a good year if you were a Democrat, particularly since that was not happening necessarily nationwide. Jay Nixon was reelected to a second term. Claire McCaskill handily beat Todd Aiken. Clint Zweifel was reelected treasurer. Jason Kander was elected Secretary of State. Chris Koster was elected as Attorney General. Not a bad year. Let's take, then if you take a look at just one of those races, the McCaskill-Aiken race, in one sense, not a good way to go, but in talking about Senate races, I think appropriate to this discussion. And you looked at where Claire did well, and just defining well as beat Aiken. She defeated Aiken not only in most of the urban counties, indeed all of the urban counties, that's no surprise, but she won in 40 of the counties that have less than 20,000 votes, quote unquote, outstate counties. By the time she ran 6 years later, against Josh Hawley, she won none of the outstate counties. For that matter, by the time Jason Kander ran against Roy Blunt in 2016, he won none of the outstate counties. So the Democratic electorate has been concentrated more and more in a small number of jurisdictions. And so until we break out of that, until we not only continue to do well in St. Louis City, St. Louis County, Kansas City, and Boone County, and okay in Jackson County outside Kansas City, and a few other of the counties in the region, until we break out of that and start to do very well in the ex-urban counties, particularly Platte, Cass, and Clay on the Kansas City side, St. Charles and Jefferson on this side of the state. I don't see us having it, and I say us because those of you on the call know I'm a longtime Democrat. I don't see us having a chance of winning a statewide contest. The demography are striking. I was talking with my son earlier tonight, and he is a political scientist also, and he moved to Rice University now in 2005. It's been quite a while. And I kidded him at the time from a blue state, he was a faculty member at Michigan State, to a red state, going right over our purple state in the process. Well, I told him that I was going to be speaking to you all tonight and I told him the question that we were going to be discussing. And he reminded me that I was on his case for going to a red state back in 2005, much redder than where Dad was. And he just reminded me that that's not the case anymore. That certainly we're not. And if you look at the demography, that's where I think the story starts. And I'll end with that. The population, I'm talking about the overall population, not the voting population of Missouri, is 80% non-Hispanic white. It's down only 7 percentage points over the last 30 years. So we are a largely white state, and we're staying that way. We're not diversifying in anything approaching a rapid rate. If we take states like Georgia and North Carolina, that's a much different story. There, the non-Hispanic white share is in the 50s. And there's been a 15 to 20 percentage point decrease in that share over the past 30 years. So confronting a party that says basically very much more in an outrageous fashion, but unfortunately, not deplorable, we don't use that word. Unfortunately, in a state that is as white as this one and has a low educational attainment rate, as the other party's position is the party of white supremacy, it creates real challenges in trying to win election in a state that's 80% white and whose voting population is probably more like 85% white. Let's hope Betsy or Ken comes along with a happier twist.
Well, actually, Terry, I agree with everything you said. To drop a name, Larry Sabato, who I've remained in contact with for many, many years, he emailed me after the election, and he said, "Whatever happened to Missouri?" He says, "I remember when Missouri used to be, the bellwether state. Went for Clinton twice in 1992 and 1996. So the question is, whatever happened to Missouri?" By the way, going into the 2016 election, Democrats did hold every statewide office except for the Lieutenant Governor's Peter Kinder's seat. So in 2016, Trump won big, and he built on what Romney won by big. Romney won by around 9.7%. And then Trump won by 18.51%. He won again big in Missouri, but only about 15%. But that's quite a shellacking. So let me go back though to 1996. I wrote a chapter for a book called Swing State Politics, and it was exactly on this subject. Whatever happened to Missouri's Democratic Party? Well, let me look at some of the statistics here. Missouri has what I called swelled the Republican vote since 1996. Between 1996 and 2012, the Republican vote in Missouri increased by 66.6% for in the presidential candidate or presidential races, I should say. While the vote for the Democratic presidential candidate increased by only 19.3%. Think about that. From 1996 to 2012, the Republican vote increased 66.6%. The Democratic vote only increased 19.3%. Karl Rove, I think, was one of the people responsible for identifying what the Republican Party needs to do to win. And I think he was right. Concentrate on your base. Terry, obviously you know this, and concentrating on your base is what seems to be successful for Republicans, particularly in the state of Missouri, where you have a very high percentage of evangelicals. Terry mentioned that the population is about just over 80% white and non-Hispanic. He's right, and Missouri's missed the trend of Hispanics coming into states. Missouri is pretty much bypassed by Hispanics, and although the Hispanic vote has increased enormously in other states, and this is what's caused Colorado and Nevada, for instance, among others, to turn from voting Republican to voting Democrat, Missouri has not experienced that influx of minorities that who vote, of course, overwhelmingly Democratic. The Missouri evangelical vote constitutes, on average, according to exit poll data, about 38% of the total vote in Missouri. And you know that evangelicals vote overwhelmingly Republican, 77% even more than that in the recent election for Trump. So Missouri, it's difficult to be very optimistic about Missouri going Democratic. Looking over some other statistics, it was not only Trump that whomped in 2016, in 2020. Look what happened to our only statewide office holder, Nicole Galloway, who lost to Mike Parsons, not exactly an impressive governor, nevertheless lost to him 57.1 to 40.7%, a real trouncing. So if you look at Missouri right now, and I'll end it here, but if you look at Missouri right now, we hold one office statewide. We only hold 2 of the U.S. rep seats. We hold no U.S. Senate seats. We are in a state of disarray. We have no promising Democrats that have the stature to win a statewide election, particularly at the U.S. Senate level, in my opinion. Please tell me who we might have, but I don't see any unless we resurrect some Democrats who have won statewide, like Jay Nixon, but Claire McCaskill, but Claire McCaskill's not going to run, and Jay Nixon will not run. So, who's out there to run? The only chance I think we have of winning is if Eric Greitens wins the Republican nomination, and he's carrying so much baggage that if we do get a credible Democratic candidate, it's possible that Eric Greitens could be defeated. But I think the Republicans are smart enough to try to get him to not win the Republican nomination. And if Eric Schmidt wins it, a person I don't exactly relate to, but he is a proven vote getter, and he will likely win that U.S. Senate race.
So I have to say, you've gotten such a clear description of the electoral landscape from both Professors Jones and Warren. So there's very little I can add in terms of their predictions. They're spot on. And I think the reality looking forward to the Senate seat is that, Missouri Democrats would need to come up with hundreds of thousands of votes. And so that just, to me, I think, at this moment, you might say, man, that's a mountain that I'm not sure we can climb. And so it's perfect that I get to be the closer because I get to be the optimism for the moment because that's where my research lines up. So my research is actually not so much on polling and prediction, although I do a lot of polling to try to think about how to measure public opinion, but largely on how to motivate voters to turn out to vote and how to think about how to change our minds. So how do you get a Republican to vote like a Democrat? And I think that's a question that is in the hearts and minds of a lot of people on this phone call. So I want to talk about two things that are really clearly research-based, and one is hard to do, and one is easy to do. So the easy to do is to mobilize your families, friends, and neighbors to turn out to vote. And I think you've probably heard this ad nauseum. But to try to think about, how could you magnify the single impact in your own lives? It's really simple, as anyone who's a parent would know. It just involves a little bit of nagging and reminding people about social norms. So it's like, hey, don't forget to vote. I'm voting because it's important to me. Put a yard sign in your yard, all those shenanigans. They really matter and they add up. And they add up significantly. So it really looks like, if you thought about how many phone calls could you make to people that you knew, not to strangers, to people that you knew, it's actually pretty significant. Each one of those nudges encourages people to go vote, make it easier to vote, bring donuts, all those little things that you can do. All right, that's one thing. And the second is trickier. And it's actually based upon an ongoing set of really research at the frontier of persuasion. And that's to have these really deep conversations with people who think differently than you do. And they're the most aggravating conversations you could possibly imagine. There are two separate lines of research here that are really distinct from one another. And I think one really talks about being passive and the other active. So in one of my favorite research papers, actually, by Ryan Enos, who's a professor at Harvard, he writes about the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment in Boston. And to test whether or not people are affected by their environments, he basically plants people who are speaking Spanish on Boston trains, and then surveys people who have had an unusual amount of people speaking Spanish on their train after they get off in terms of their immigration sentiment. Or the placebo here is comparing people who didn't have a lot of people speaking a different language on the train. And what he finds is just observing people who are speaking a different language is going to dramatically increase anti-immigrant sentiment. So seeing people who are different actually makes the world worse sometimes. But to contrast with that, there's a line of research that's really amazing by Josh Kalla and David Brookman. And in that study, they look really hard to see what happens if they go deep into the heart of country where people think radically different thoughts. And they knock on the door and they say, hey, can I talk about a time where you were treated differently? And just have a really heart-to-heart conversation. Short, 10 minutes, but a real heart-to-heart conversation focused on listening and finding common ground, and then saying, hey, this really matters to me. Now, that's a hard conversation to have. I don't know about you, but I find it very hard when I have to sit down and talk to someone who's going to say something I find deeply offensive, or I find, I just want to shout no at the top of my lungs. But those conversations move opinion, and they move them for months. It's the most stable way and persuasive way we know to actually change hearts and minds. So I think the moment here to say, hey, how could the Democrats win a Senate seat? It would be to start this kind of deep canvassing now, and to start moving it into places where the needle could be moved just a little bit. So looking for cases where there were close elections, looking for instances where you have a larger number of younger or more independent voters, but looking for places where you wouldn't necessarily expect a Democrat to win and doing some of that canvassing. I don't expect that without a big change in national, political campaigning, a big turn in the economy, or maybe the Eric Greitens effect, that a Democrat is likely to win, but I think it's possible. That's it. That's my closer.
Thank you. The other half of the question is, if you could build the ideal candidate, and I'm going to throw this out no holds barred. So, what would that candidate look like? And for example, I personally think that a lot of the animus towards Democrats is because of the pro-life movement demonizing Democrats, or at least using that as a litmus test. So any profile, even a pro-life Democrat, could, what characteristics of a Democrat could possibly win? A candidate that you could create. Professor Jones, you want to lead that one off, or?
Well, I'm going to lead it off by saying I don't think it's a good question, or it's a good approach. To date myself, and possibly Ken as well, there was a novel back, talking about the 480, Ken, by Eugene Burdick, about, in effect, designing candidates. Makes us feel like a Frankenstein. Go into the lab and work out the perfect candidate. I don't think candidate characteristics or issue positions are at the top of the list or even at the middle of the list. Things like Betsy mentioned, organization and one-on-ones are much more important. If the candidate is approachable and seen as a good listener, those are characteristics that matter. But whether he's tall or short, or a he or a she, or binary or not binary, the whole list goes on. Doesn't matter. And nor does it need to be an issue position, as long as it's somewhere, not at one or the other extreme. That doesn't matter much either. So it's more of the grassroots, the volunteers, the mobilization, then all of which I might add takes money. I mean, there's a notion that volunteers stuff. Volunteers need a solid database that's regularly updated, and that's not cheap. If it's going to be done well, it's going to cost a lot of money. But with that kind of effort, that again, the Abrams effort in Georgia would be an example of that. You can make a good deal of progress. So it's the search for a perfect candidate. I think is the wrong question and the wrong direction to go, Harvey.
Okay.
Yeah,
There's sure a lot of partisan motivated reasoning here. So I think when people see the partisan label in the ballot, they don't see much else. And I know that from people who are deeply interested in politics, it's usually hard to believe this, but most people don't actually care about politics. And so I think the reality is that people are just trying to make, the easiest decision they can. They see the party label, they move on with their day. I think that actually the best Democrat that we could find has very little to do with policy. And it has a ton to do with these other traits. So we're looking for someone who's extremely charismatic. And we're looking for someone who is great at marketing and has hired, someone who can build a brand. And I think those are traits that have more to do with pushing towards the lens of someone who could be an extraordinarily inspirational speaker, someone has a firm handshake and looks you right in the eye. Like, I think about this, that, this is an MBA student. Like, that's the kind of person who has those kinds of traits is going to be a really strong candidate to, manage a strong team. And I think those are traits that are hard to get, but where there is this moment here of tremendous optimism, which is that candidate has been sitting and waiting for the chance to run in an open seat. So the strongest candidates emerge in these moments where there are open seat contests. So I think that's the chance that we have here.
Well, if I can
Professor
add to
Warren.
that, yes, if I can add to that, where have all the flowers gone? Where have all the Democratic voters gone? In political science, we know that when we talk about determinants of vote choice, it's textbook to say that the greatest determinant of vote choice is partisanship, then image, and then issues. Most voters don't follow politics that much. They don't like politics that much. And if they vote at all, if they're Republicans, they're going to vote for Republicans. If they're Democrats, they're going to vote for Democrats. 96%, I'm sorry, 94% of Democrats voted for Biden in the last election, according to exit poll data, and 94% of Republicans voted for Trump. So as I see it, the reason I'm pessimistic about the ability of a Democratic candidate to win the U.S. Senate seat in 2022 is I don't see enough Democratic voters out there right now to cast the ballot for this Democratic candidate, regardless of how ideal that Democratic candidate is. I agree with Betsy that certainly that if you have an ideal, charismatic Democratic candidate, that will help a lot. But what means the most is when people go and vote, how many people will be Democrats voting and how many people will be Republicans voting? Again, regardless of their backgrounds and so forth, what determines how people vote the most by far is partisanship. And we simply have lost Democratic voters in the state of Missouri, or better, to put it a better way, we haven't lost Democratic voters. It's just that a lot more voters are voting Republican than in past years. And that's what the Democratic Party has to do. The Democratic Party has to find more Democratic voters and get them out to vote.
One of the questions in the chat is mentioning that several years ago there was a Democrat running in every race. That wasn't the case recently. I'm going to rephrase this a little bit. If we had a Democrat running in every race, would that help? And do you have any suggestions on how to recruit said people?
The answer, I'm assuming you're talking primarily about state rep races and having a candidate in every state rep race. And the answer is yes, because that candidate is going to bring out his friends, his neighbors, his family, and you can cut the margins by several hundred votes, maybe 1,000 or so in these smaller areas per county. On the other hand, asking an individual to do that and to, for the sake of the party, and to enter a race that has a very low chance of being successful, requires a lot of sacrificial lambs.
Yeah. Anyone else want to take that question?
Actually, I would say that it's really hard to get people to run for public office. I think it's never been harder because I feel like we're doing a really terrible job, to be perfectly candid, protecting people who are running for public office on social media. And I think even serving in public office right now is pretty terrible. It's a really incredibly hard job. And I think especially for these positions where people are running because they thought they were, running, they're deeply embedded as members of their civic community. They care a lot about what they're doing. They care a lot about their neighbors. And all of a sudden they run for school board, for local alderman, maybe for mayor of a small city. And they are suddenly lambasted on social media for a basically unpaid position. And the vitriol that we fire at these folks is unparalleled. So I think it is getting harder to get people to run because it's basically this incredible public service that we're asking of people. And we don't really have a great way to acknowledge the effort that is going into these campaigns. So I think that there are probably 3 steps that need to happen here. And one is something that you could do right now, which is take a moment and just thank a public official. They don't get a lot of those emails. Thank your city manager. They just say like, thanks, I really appreciate all the work you're doing. Like make that person's job a little bit better today. That will help. And the second is to I think to systematically think about how it is that we encourage folks to run. So, St. Louis mayor had a much higher bar here for signatures. So thinking about, where are the hurdles here? Where are the frictions? Helping people get through those hurdles, like volunteering to do that kind of like really banal campaign work. Like people don't usually start their public service careers as running for US Senate. And the third, and I think this is like incredibly important to hear as a Democratic club, is to really take a moment to applaud the losers. And so for the people you know who have run and lost, you know, make sure that you offer to pay for their invitation to the next time you have a fundraiser. Like invite them to your table. Like, you know, give some kind of acknowledgement that you see them. And it could be these really little things, but I feel like, you know, lots of campaigns will give you a yard sign if you make a donation. Offer to do that for them. Like there are ways that we can be saying thank you to the people who are willing to like really keep the machinery running here. And we could be doing a much better job as a society doing that.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat. Could a Democrat in Missouri who is similar to Reverend Warnock in Georgia win votes in the rural areas? Anyone want to take that question?
Well, if you look at the districts, the Republican districts that have been carved out in the state of Missouri by the Republican Party since 2010, it takes a lot for a person to run as a Democrat in these districts. I tend to be a realist. Some people like to call me cynical, and I said, well, I'm not really cynical. I'm just realist. A realist. When people come to me and ask for my advice on running in a particular district, I'll do my homework and I'll look at the district. I'm talking about a state Senate seat or a state rep seat. And I will meet with them, and I frequently, turn them off by saying that, well, I've studied this district since 1939 or something, which was the case, and it had hardly been changed since 1939. And this person was a Democrat wanting to run. And I said, a Democrat hasn't won this district since 1939 or whatever. And I said, it's going to be really tough. And so it is very tough to get people to run in districts that they don't have a realistic chance of winning or even a realistic chance of coming close. And so I put that question out to this group. How do you get people to run? And does it make sense to run and essentially, quote, waste resources, giving money to Democrats to run in districts that, political scientists are going to look at the district and they're going to say, given habitual voting behavior, and they're what are called low visibility races, meaning that most people don't know really the candidates, and they're going to go in and vote while they're voting for U.S. Senate or governor. And incidentally, if it's a Republican district, they're going to vote for the Republican candidate for state rep and state Senate as well. And so it makes it very, very difficult for Democrats to run, get money, attract money for their campaigns and supporters when the district looks like it's hopeless. So please be more optimistic than I am on that.
Ken, I'd like to ask you, I'm going to turn that around maybe. What districts, Senate or House, do you see that are potentially swing districts that if folks focused on those races, Democrats could win?
Well, of course, that makes the most sense, and Harvey, is to concentrate efforts on districts that can be won. That's exactly, of course, on a larger level on U.S. rep race and U.S. Senate races. That's exactly what the national parties do. They handicap races, and they will write off races, and for good reason, that where, let's say, a Democratic candidate has not a dog's chance of winning, they're not going to really give that Democrat any money. They realize it's hopeless, but they will pour a lot of money into races, U.S. rep races and U.S. Senate races, where there's a realistic chance of that candidate winning. And it could be in Missouri next time, because as Betsy said, it's going to be an open seat. And that means a lot, because if you look at political scientists know the statistics on the enormous reelection rate of incumbents. I mean, the U.S. reps win at a 93% plus reelection rate. So trying to beat an incumbent U.S. rep is tough. It's not as hard to be a U.S. senator because they're running statewide and their districts are, quote, more diverse. But still, it's difficult to beat an incumbent U.S. Senator. But in 2022, as Betsy noted, this is an open seat, and it's much easier for a Democrat this time around to win an open seat.
Let me offer some answers or possibilities. The places where the most likelihood of making success, if you're willing to make a decade-long effort, would be large portions of St. Charles County, Platte County, Cass County, Clay County, West St. Louis County, and Northern Jefferson County, all of which have demographics, particularly in terms of educational attainment, that are moving in the Democrats' direction as we become closer and closer to now how much education you have being a predictor of Democratic support. But let's look at Deb Lavender. Let's take her as an example. Look what it took for Deb Lavender to make that succeed in Kirkwood, running multiple times before she won, and then having a very tough race for state senate this last cycle. So it's not easy. It requires candidates with the energy and talent of a Deb Lavender, and it requires candidates who had her ability to attract hundreds of volunteers to her campaign. And that it also would be helpful to have a party that had the analytical apparatus to make that all easier to bring off.
Betsy, you care to comment on this one, or?
I think these gentlemen have done it. I think they've got it right. I mean, I think Deb Lavender can speak to this. This is a tricky one to navigate. It's a really complicated issue.
And we all thank Deb Lavender for her service and her efforts in this past campaign as well. Thanks again, Deb.
Thank you.
We hope you're not done.
That's what I was about to say.
Thank
we
you.
know someone who's got some experience on this call.
Yep.
Might do it again.
There's a question in the chat. What role do you see Gen Z playing in this? Will the fact that a new generation is now part of the voting demographic meaningfully shift outcomes? Is it worthwhile to tap into this new demographic? And I'm going to add, and how do you tap that demographic?
First of all,
Betsy, that one's probably yours.
let me just offer one empirical observation. It's Gen Z educated in terms of college degree or more versus Gen Z not college educated. So if the question is about Gen Z as a whole, it's better off separating it by educational level.
Yeah, we did a SLU poll. We hired YouGov. We weren't totally happy with YouGov, but one thing we did see is what Terry just pointed out. When you look at the demographics, it's flipped in recent decades. The well-educated people are voting Democratic now, and that was not the case at one time. But more college educated. I mean, it's more split. But I mean, still, when you see the college grads, and particularly those with graduate degrees, and how they've lined up for Trump versus Biden, it was like night and day, with the higher educated people overwhelmingly supporting Biden. So I think that there is hope for the Democratic Party nationwide, not so much in Missouri because of what Terry said earlier, because of the consistency of the white population in Missouri. We're just not attracting enough minorities to turn the state around like in other states. We remain very white, and I would argue that not only very white, but we have turned conservative whites. Because if you look what Clinton did in rural areas, Clinton did fairly decently in rural areas. He won quite a few rural counties. Gore won just a tiny few, and then Kerry won none, as I remember, maybe Boone County, I can't remember, but he did terribly in these rural counties. So we have to, hopefully, if we turnout as Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. You know, she did not just concentrate on turning out the black vote. She got registered the 18-year-olders who just were voting for the first time, and she turned out a youth vote and a black vote, and she was able to win for Biden in Georgia. And that's what the Democrats need to do in Missouri. But we have more obstacles in Missouri because we don't have a large minority population to focus on and get them to vote so that Missouri can go Democrat.
Those are very accurate statements. I mean, we see our students check their email once a day and their phones 40 to 80 times a day. So it's a completely different place of engagement. I feel like one of the really interesting moments of transition, both for how we are seeing this younger generation engage with voting, but also with just participating, is that they're going to do it on mobile phones. And they're going to do it, when they're waiting for their kids' soccer games to start when they're a little bit older. And they're going to do it in a really different way. And so I think we start to think about like, well, it's not just like how that this generation is going to participate in turning out to vote in this particular Senate race, but how this generation is going to engage with elected representatives more broadly. And it's going to be a different world. This is an age of students where, they equate sending an email with how my generation thought about sending a letter through the US Postal Service. It's something that older people do. And so they'll do it if they have to talk to someone like me, but they don't do it to each other. They don't email each other. That's not how they communicate. And so I think when we think about the kind of candidate that's going to be attractive to this cohort, it's going to be a candidate with a pretty smooth social media operation. There's going to be a candidate that's campaigning, can engage with this kind and style of communication. And so when we think about what does canvassing look like, and what does polling look like, and what does persuasion look like, it's going to happen a lot more on phones. It's going to happen a lot more via relational campaigning. And it's going to happen in a really, in shorter moments of engagement. So I think, how will this generation affect campaigning? It's a successful candidate is going to run a different kind of campaign and with a different messaging strategy that can engage with these spaces. I think we've been seeing, presidential campaigns move to these media for a long time now, actually. I remember when, Michelle Obama had whatever the Craft Network pages of things she had liked. And I was like, they're going, Barack Obama had a Spotify playlist before anyone else did. So I think we're seeing these spaces, but I think it will be really exciting when, the Missouri Senate race has all kinds of TikTok videos, but we're about to be there. So I think that's partly how this generation is changing. It's changing the way that candidates communicate with voters. Will this generation change the outcome? Will they turn out in unparalleled numbers in 2020? And I think what will be really interesting, depending on what's happening with our national politics, is we may actually see many Republican voters stay home. So, that's something that we don't think about a lot, but there may be a whole bunch of people who voted in 2020 who, as the national political tides change, are going to be less motivated to vote in 2022.
Excellent.
Can
We
I
have
add one
a
more
raised
comment to
hand
that?
here. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ken.
Just let me add one more comment because I want to add on to what Betsy said. I think the support for Trump is probably exaggerated. He probably is, according to poll data, the most popular Republican with Republicans. But if you look at what happened to him in that last election, he got creamed with independents. He did well with independents in 2016, got creamed by independents. I think he lost them by 13%, if I recall the exit poll data. This is promising for even Missouri because Josh Hawley's popularity fell a lot, according to polls, given his crazy behavior in the post-election period. And Trump's support dropped also in Missouri. So you kind of wonder what damage was caused to the Republican Party in Missouri. And that gives some hope to Democrats going into 2022. How damaged is the Republican Party nationally? How damaged is it in Missouri? I can't believe it's in great shape, given the splintering you see among Republicans. Look at Boehner's book that just came out. I mean, the kind of things that are going on between Republicans, so to speak, establishment sane Republicans, and as Boehner said, the wacko Republicans that have taken over the Republican Party. I can't believe that that's good for the Republican Party. And I think that Missouri Democrats can benefit from it if they know how to take advantage of the splintering of the Republican Party nationwide, and even in Missouri, according to polls, because the Republican Party is not as popular in Missouri as it was, let's say, pre-2020 election.
Any other panelists? I think everyone's weighed in on this. Okay, we did have a raised hand for a live question. Stanley Ferdman, if you want to unmute.
Yes, I'd like to challenge the group, maybe the whole group. I think it was Terry, in his presentation, pardon me, who said, well, what if, right? He said, what if it wound up that Greitens was the candidate? Either of the candidates may be damaged enough that it's a what if. If either one of them were candidates, I would say the possibility. What if that was so? What kind of person? Who would we know? That is a possibility, because I think you're right. I think the damage is there. I think there'll be. I'm hopeful that over the next year or two, be much bigger damage, and I would think that that's what we have to hope for. We have to hope that things begin to go our right way in a bit. And if our president doesn't quite overdo it too much, that gets enough credit and enough plus marks that other people begin to say Democrats are moving towards a way that's helpful to us living. So what if can you come up with a name? Can you come up with a type? We need to, we've discussed all of the negatives. We all now feel it and know that there may be barely a chance. But we can't leave the meeting with thinking that. I think we have to think positively of ways to create a chance, ways to establish positive feeling amongst us, because God knows we know that nothing has gone the way we would like to see it in our community, in our state.
Thank you. That goes along also with a question in the chat. Republicans voted in Missouri against right to work. They voted for health care, but the Democratic brand turns them off. What can we do to create a positive environment for Democrats?
I share, Stanley, your optimism and the need to think in a way that is positive and will lead us forward. I just caution all of us to think that way includes, let's find somebody on a horse who is just so spectacular, everybody will think, or not enough will, or a majority will think that individual will be the one to lead us to the promised land. I think it's much more of an organizational and group endeavor. And if we have to depend on a magical candidate, that might be a good in the short run, but it's not going to do anything beyond one election.
Yeah, think both ways.
First of all, and secondly, if Greitens is a candidate, well, take a step back. We do not have consistent, high quality, neutral party polling in Missouri. There's no university that polls on a regular basis, year in, year out. There's nothing like the California poll that California has that's done by a foundation. So we are reliant on primarily leaked polls, and I'm not being critical of Remington Research, but it's it's a IRV, what you would call a robocall, what we call IRV, response voter. But if the latest Remington poll has Greitens beating Nixon, if Nixon Jay were the candidate. So we should not fall into the thinking that Greitens would be necessarily a flawed candidate. I talked about my Bayesian frame of mind. The way that logic worked is, okay, knowing what you know now, what do you think the odds are? Okay, let me give you another scenario. What if Greitens were the candidate? What would that change the odds? I would ask Ken as well and Betsy, if Greitens were the candidate against a stock Democrat, I think Greitens would be a 60% favorite.
Well, again, based on partisanship alone, if partisanship is the greatest determinant of vote choice, which it is, and you have more Republicans, the thing is, Republicans will vote for a lot of Republican candidates they don't like. And I think that Trump is evidence of that. And that's because they hate Democrats. I mean, they're not going to vote for a Democrat. And so, again, if you have more Republicans out there voting than Democrats, even a flawed candidate like Greitens, I agree with Terry, even a flawed candidate like Greitens could win and shock Democrats who think that he's so flawed that he would lose. But again, if you have mostly Republicans voting, and again, 94% of Republicans voted for Trump nationally, the Democrats are in trouble in Missouri.
So I would like to leave this call, Stanley, with both a sense of optimism, but also a sense of what Ken just said. So I'm going to draw a parallel and then I'm going to tell you a story. So I think that there's all this research out there that describes teaching evaluations, who gets good teaching evaluations and their biases. And basically, if you're Brad Pitt, you're going to get great teaching evaluations. You get better teaching evaluations if you're tall. I'm almost 5'2", so I'm sunk there. If you're male, well, I'm sunk there. And if you're incredibly handsome, and I just think, well, I'm doomed. And I tell my students this when we're talking about my intro stats classes. And then I say, so the fact that if I ever get good teaching evaluations, it's because I really put in all of the legwork here to think about how it is to navigate this process. And I feel like any Democrat running in this Senate contest, it's like we're trying to get good teaching evaluations. And then all of these things are lined up against them. And the only way we can overcome all of these implicit biases and how voters are going to view the world is if we put in all the legwork to really make it count, to overcome each of those things. And each of those things that gets overcome is exactly what Professor Jones has articulated. It's building an extremely strong community. It's doing that kind of deep canvassing. And in some sense, it's just acknowledging that the past is not always predictive of the future. And so you don't know what the political tides will bring, what scandals will happen in the 11th hour. And so it's worth putting in the work at this moment because you're just not sure what's going to happen. But each person that we talk to and each conversation that we have, it really builds the potential for a different kind of candidate to win, if not this election, then the next one. And so, I think it's a struggle for the candidates, and it's a struggle for all of us who are volunteering and working in campaigns to encourage the volunteers who are looking at the same polling numbers that we are, to say, hey, but this one really matters. But it really matters for a very long game. And I think that there's a real sense that the Trump presidency has mobilized a set of voters who will not continue to be as mobilized without such a spark plug as their candidate. So, I think we may see demobilization among the core Republican voters. We're still going to see a lot of Republican mobilization, but with the right ground game, I think there's a real chance that, there could be tremendous Democratic mobilization in this particular case.
Is there a danger of seeing demobilization on the Democratic side as well, because we don't have a demon to hate as much?
We still have a demon to hate. So, if Eric Greitens is the candidate, I think there will be one for sure. There's a long and growing literature in political science on what we call negative partisanship, which means people who get really excited about something, not because they're so excited about their own partisanship, but because they oppose something else. And it's just, you know, I think all the people who are out there drinking Pepsi right now or boycotting baseball are deep into this negative partisanship game. So, you know, I think there's a chance here that I mean, that's why I think that Greitens' candidacy actually could be incredibly mobilizing. It's because of this negative partisanship.
Boy, I can see the ad, the political ad now. Strike one, and you have a picture of Greitens. Strike two, and you have a picture of Hawley. No, don't make strike three, and you have a picture of whoever the Republican candidate is. 3 strikes, you're out. Anyway, they certainly have a track record of some interesting scandals. There is a question earlier, if any of you would like to address what happened in Missouri 2nd District. Looked like Jill Shoup had a fighting chance, and the numbers just didn't come in that way.
Well, you know what I already said, Harvey, about incumbents. They always seem to pull them out. You know, almost always. Obviously, Lacey Clay didn't win the primary, but I'll tell you, the you know, textbooks, they list all the advantages of incumbency, and if you're a challenger, it's definitely something to worry about. I can't, you know, I remember in 2016 when Nate Silver showed that all these U.S. senators, incumbent U.S. senators, were going to go down and the Democrats were going to take over the Senate. And it didn't happen. You know, when push came to shove, all these senators ended up winning re-election, practically all of them. And so it's tough to beat an incumbent, and that's what happened, I think, in the 2nd Congressional District. You know, the Democrats were trying to take down a familiar incumbent in the 2nd Congressional District, and it didn't happen.
Let me give you a number or two, Harvey. Research done on similar districts, which is to say suburban, highly educated Republican incumbent who had a support Trump record. So all of that describes Ann Wankner. In the typical one of those districts, the Trump vote went down by almost 10 points. And in many of those districts, they were flipped. But in the 2nd Congressional District, the Trump vote stayed the same 2016 to 2020. So there was no Trump. You thought from word of mouth, and Deb, I would ask you if you would chime in, because you were knocking on more doors than any of us. Were you hearing, from your perspective, more anti-Trump sentiment or not?
No, I would say that Trump and the virus are what I place a lot of the reason why I lost, especially when Trump and then Parson both got the virus and they both came out. You know, you think of the closings in the city, in the county. I think that's a lot of why both Jill and I lost.
So certainly the campaign plan was counting on, Deb was, and Jill was as well, that there would be an anti-Trump vote, not massive, but enough to cost the Republicans a few percentage points. That did not materialize.
Okay. Alan, I think you've been watching the chat also. Are there any questions that I've missed?
There have been a couple that got answered with links. For instance, what's the percentage of independents that are in Missouri? And Professor Sinclair mentioned that it's hard to gauge who are independents because folks may claim to be nonpartisan, but they really do lean one way or the other. But she put in a link to the Pew Forum. There's a thing there about Missouri, so folks can click in that if they are interested in digging into those data more.
Okay, while Alan's looking, if there are any other questions, Thank you for the kind words, Betsy. For those not watching the chat, she says she's so proud of all of your engagement. It makes me proud to be a Missourian. Thank you. Are there any other questions? Folks want to just unmute and ask away or put things in the chat? I think we may have hit our limit. For those of you not familiar with Zoom, if you want to save the chat, and there's a lot of useful links in the chat, if you open the chat up from the 3 dots on the bottom of your screen, or however you can figure out to open the chat, once it's open, there's 3 dots, about 2/3 of the way down on the right-hand side. If you click on that, you can save the chat. It will put it into a folder called Zoom on your computers, and that way you'll have access to all the links that were referenced there today. With that, are there any other comments? Anything else I need to cover?
I just want to thank all of you for all of you've done for the St. Louis County and Missouri, and how fortunate I am to have known so many of you all these years.
Yes, sir. Terry, absolutely.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah, thank you, Harvey, for arranging this, and to Betsy and to Terry for giving their insights. They're very valuable to this whole group.
A little demoralizing, but I also thank you for bringing everything straight up. You were, and I think it's very helpful.
Dale, do you have your hand raised?
Yeah, one question. If we can't win public office, what are the other ways are there that we can change things that are happening, or support things that we want to happen?
I have an answer for this.
Shoot the incumbents.
All right. So this is a plug for my research. This is the plug, the sales pitch that ends the phone call, but it's a free sales plug. I spend a lot of time thinking about how we can build up the communities with the organizations we care about, nonprofits, schools, religious communities. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. And especially because people don't have time, I built a civic engagement app. It's free to use. So I'll put the website in the chat. I feel like the best way forwards, and for all of us to remember, these kinds of communities that you're doing right now are incredibly integral in the success of every democracy. These micro communities where people are coming together because they just want to make their communities and neighborhoods better. And so I built software to support you. So I'll put it in the chat. You're welcome to use it. It's called Magnify Your Voice. We do little things like we help bring to the attention, broken swings at the park or crosswalks that need attention. And we do bigger things like look for volunteers to staff the local alderman debate or whatever these little tiny things are, these micro volunteering opportunities that are the glue. I feel like as we see our nation polarize and we increasingly see the level of vitriol between Republicans and Democrats, one of the things that we can do is just remember to come back to those basic civic actions and do them. And I think that helps us build connections with people who are really different with us, which gives us a chance to be persuasive. And it also gives us a chance to sustain communities that are really under attack right now from pretty awful national politics. So I would say, take civic engagement seriously. And that's my punchline, my closer for the night. Thanks for your question.
That's fantastic. We also have a couple of raised hands if folks would hang in there. If I can figure out Susan Turk.
I'm not usually able to attend your meetings because I have a conflict. So I was really glad I was able to attend this one tonight. And I was wondering if you have ever had Michael Butler speak to you, the new chair of the state Democratic Party.
I would like to speak on that. Harvey?
Yeah, Florence, I think go ahead, Florence.
Yes, I would like to speak on that. Michael Butler is going to speak at our next meeting on May 17th. And I'm sure he will be talking about the vision of the Democratic Party. So we hope you all can attend that evening.
And I think it's vitally important that everyone who's here tonight attend that meeting, because you will get an entirely different perspective from Michael, who is working very hard to make 2022 a critical year for Democrats in the state of Missouri. He's optimistic, and he's working to make the kind of change that we all want to see. And a disclaimer, I should say, I serve on his state advisory committee. And so I've heard him speak about his plans, and it's going to give you quite a bit to think about listening to him.
Excellent. Well, I hope to see everyone in, I guess that's 5 weeks away. This meeting was actually a week earlier than our regular meeting. So third Monday is when we usually meet. And I want to thank our panelists once again. This has been very enlightening, very engaging. And I guess just a quick plug for another tool that's out there if you want to track legislation. It's called Fast Democracy. I think it's fastdemocracy, either .com or .org. You can track all kinds of bills, not just in Missouri, but across the country. Take a look at that if there's anything that you're passionate about. It has a lot of good, easy to access information. And unless there's any other comments, I'll ask Florence, do you have any closing words?
No, I'm just happy that we were able to have as many participants as we had tonight, and the discussion was just outstanding. And I look forward to hearing from the panel again. So thank you all very much.
Once again, thank you, everybody. And with that, we'll conclude the meeting. I'll give you a moment to save the chat. Again, there's 3 dots on the lower right-hand side. If you click that, you have the option to save the chat. It doesn't work on cell phones, only on computers.
Okay, I got you there. Thank you.